Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Birte Sniltsveit. I'm the Director for Synthesis and Reviews at 3IE and head of our London office. I have the great pleasure of co-chairing this session with Harsha, Dayal from DPME and AEN in South Africa. I'll hand over to Harsha in a minute to introduce herself a bit more and our panel. But first, just to say a few words, kind of framing why we are doing these sessions. So, as I'm sure you all know, concepts such as localization and decolonization has gained prominence in the development discourse in recent years and are increasingly featured in the policy statements of major aid agencies, for example, and funders. And at the heart of these ideas are objectives around local ownership, agencies with the resources that today are close, that are going to primarily northern organizations, directed to a larger degree to organizations in the global south. The rationale for this agenda is both one of equity and ethics, but it's also one of effectiveness and relevance. As been made quite clear, I think, so far in this conference, a key theme is the importance of national evidence generators and brokers for effective and sustainable institutionalization of evidence. And I think the point was made yesterday that EIDM also has a role in improving the functioning of the state, which further highlights why the importance of national actors driving this agenda. But these ideas are not new. They've been coming and going in development discourse. But despite these stated goals and of many actors, the development in the development and evidence communities for decades, progress is still limited in terms of resources and voice. So, for example, a study from 2021 looking at the articles published in top development journals found that between 1990 and 2019, almost 3/4 of the articles were published by Northern researchers. We've done a similar analysis of data on our development evidence portal. There the picture is looking a bit better, and that might be because we're also including grey literature, so unpublished studies. But there is still huge amounts of literature being published about countries in the global south with no authors from those countries. This event has so far highlighted the energy and creativity and capacity of you all and across the continent. And so imagine what would be possible if the resources were a bit more equally distributed than what it is today. So why have we not made more progress? Why does most of the funding go to northern organizations and researchers in the north? What are the key barriers to localization? And what are promising strategies for addressing these barriers? And how can national and global organizations work together to facilitate a shift? So these are the key questions that are motivating this panel, and the panel will be followed by a workshop. So we really hope that you will come back after the break and help come up with very concrete and constructive ideas based on your experience for how we can together make more progress towards greater localization. And so with that, I'll hand over to Harsha.
Thank you so much. I didn't put anything on, so this is working, right? So thanks, Birte, and a very warm welcome to our panelists. My name is Harsha Dayal. I'm Director of Research and Knowledge Management in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, DPME in short, in the South African Presidency. So I think this localization opportunity for this hour, Adeline yesterday had thrown a challenge to us, and I think we can take this challenge head on to start unpacking this issue of localization. And very nicely, I think, other than the evidence agenda, you also put out, is localization a metaphor? And, you know, on the other side, it really is about coming home. And I don't know if we want to ask ourselves, is localization the opposite of globalization? So it's really more than that, right? But I think for us, coming home means, and maybe let's stick with localization if you don't, even if you don't agree with the definition of it per se. It is about identity, about belonging, and, you know, we talk about cohesion, right? But then I'm really intrigued to hear from the panelists, because when it comes to the evidence agenda, it's about, from a public perspective as well, these multiple realities and who's defining these multiple realities. So we really want to hear from the panelists. You do have it in your packs where the panelists do come from. I don't want to take up too much time in introducing them because we really want to hear what they say, but they are, we're going to go in this order. So Sajilu Kamwenda, he is from the Mastercard Foundation, Outcome and Impact Evaluation Director. We have Andrea Ordóñez Llanos from Executive Southern Voice, and she's joining us online. Then we have Chibwana, he's Program Officer from the Hewlett Foundation. And then we have Maurice Motisya, just on my right-hand side now, from Kenya, Director of Research from the Zizi Afrique Foundation. So, colleagues, I think I'm going to say to you that we want to pose very specific questions to you. If you can take maybe 3 minutes to introduce yourselves if you need to still, and your reflections and perspectives on localization. So, Sajilu, let me start with you, right? What does success look like from your perspective in the localization agenda?
Thanks, and good morning, everyone. Sajilu is my name. I work with the Mastercard Foundation. So briefly maybe about the foundation. What we're looking at is to accelerate opportunities for young women and men, transitioning them to dignified and fulfilling work. We have Young Africa Works strategy, aiming at 30 million young women and men. And then we also work with indigenous communities in Canada. What does success look like when we talk localization? First of all, acknowledging that it's a very difficult conversation, but Mastercard Foundation has a position on that. Firstly, we have moved from Canada to establish presence here in Africa. So our offices are here. We do have programs in Canada, but you find most of our senior managers, most of our people here. And we are committed. We have clear goals in terms of working with local partners. Our current goal is to work with 75% of local indigenous partners. What does success look like? I will focus on how we do impact or evidence. We have a strategy, our impact strategy. One of the key aspects there is around what we call honoring indigenous ways of knowing. very clear about that. There's no ambiguity. We acknowledge that we should honor local context, we should honor local ways of knowing, because we know that what gets measured is political. We want to measure what matters for the young women and men in Africa and even our indigenous communities in Canada. Success as well means inclusion. We have to acknowledge, I think my colleague Adeline spoke about decolonization. Most of us, myself included, much of my education really was a product of colonialism. Studied anthropology, and much of my readings in anthropology were coming from the global north. So we need to talk about how inclusive the field of evidence is. We also need to celebrate diversity. Africa is a continent of diversity. So for me, success related to inclusion is diversity. When we say we measure what matters, so what matters for someone in Kitgum in northern Uganda might be different for someone in Kalashane in Eswatini. So appreciating that diversity as well is important. And then non-extractive ways of getting evidence as well. Evidence, sometimes we can be very extractive. I've been guilty of that, guilty as charged, but acknowledging that as we collect data as well, it should not be extractive. And then maybe lastly, really, just to come back to measuring what matters, as a foundation, we're doing quite a number of measurement processes across the continent. In Africa and Canada, we just rolled out baseline surveys around youth employment. Before doing that, we reached out to young women and men and said, what does it mean for you to transition to dignified and fulfilling work? And we went beyond the numbers, talking of quality of life. What does quality of life mean for the young women and men we work with? I'll pause here for now. Thank you.
Andrea, is she online there? Can we get Andrea
Yeah.
online?
Hello, can you hear me?
Andrea,
Yeah.
while you're coming online, same question. Just to reflect for 3 minutes, what does success look like from your perspective in the localization agenda?
First, thank you for the invitation and for welcoming me virtually. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Which is 5 different strategies, but I think the one that's more relevant to this work is what we call the evidence-informed policy-making strategy. And the goal there is to help governments in East and West Africa to more systematically use data and evidence for decision-making, supporting the work of think tanks. I think a lot of organizations that are here have worked in one way or another with the Hewlett Foundation. And so I think within that context, localization is a big issue. It's a big priority for us. And I think I'll speak about why that is, and then get to the question of what does success look like for us. So we just went through a refresh of our strategy, which we've been implementing since 2015. And I think one of the things that came very clearly in the evaluation of the previous strategy is how we get to impact. That I think we found that relationships between policymakers and evidence producers and evidence translators, brokers, whatever you call them, trusted relationships are critical to bridging that evidence to policy gap. And the closer that actors are to policymakers, the easier it is to bridge that gap, to build that trust. Now, you can do that if you're operating from outside of Washington, D.C., or the western part of the US, but it's just harder. It's easier if you're in Kenya, the policymaker is in Kenya, you're in Uganda, the policymaker is in Uganda. So I think we're using the term proximate instead of local, proximate actors, which could be actors that may not necessarily be entirely African, but they have their whole staff based in Ghana, they have the whole staff based in Senegal. They're very close to the policymakers that we're hoping to help. And so for purposes of impact, it just makes sense for us to work closely and support the work of those proximate actors. It's also just sustainable for the work that we do. I think there's an example from during COVID, when COVID first happened. I remember I was in Zambia back in 2020, working for a somewhat proximate organization. It is a proximate organization. And other organizations that were not non-African, had a lot of non-African staff. What happened, I think we all saw that there was just an exodus of people. People just left and went back to their countries because everybody was afraid that COVID would overwhelm our health systems in Africa. And these were people that were working with policymakers, helping them make decisions. And as you all remember, during COVID was when we saw the most demand for evidence. But those people left. And then our policymakers were left to their own devices to make decisions. The organizations, however, that were local and proximate still had their staff in Africa. And they continued to work and help the policymakers to generate evidence around school closures, school reopenings. And then after those waves of COVID went away, those people came back, and then they tried to make themselves relevant again. So you see how, from a strategic and impact and a dignity perspective, it just makes sense to support those that are very close and proximate to decision makers. Now I'm preaching to the choir because I think we all believe that it's important. But I think for us then, what does success look like? I think there are two elements. One is that the proximate actors that we work with have more capacity to do their work. So that's capacity to generate evidence, to communicate that evidence to policymakers. But then that also goes with resources, that they actually have the budget to be able to do that work. That I think if we combine those two, we'll have a stronger ecosystem of proximate and local organizations that are close to policymakers that in the long run will continue to support this work and support policymaking.
Thank you so much. Andrea, let's check if we can hear you. We're not seeing Andrea. Can online support please help us there? All right. I hope we're going to, apologies for that. I hope we're going to be sorted after the last of our panelists. Okay, are we trying that?
Hello?
Good, we can hear her, but we can't see Andrea.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Can the volume be up a little bit? There we go. Andrea, we can see you, or we hope we can hear you. So Andrea, let me just pose the question again, and for you to reflect for the 3 minutes to on your perspectives of localization. What does success look like from your perspective in the localization agenda? Thanks, Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to join virtually. I'm Andrea Ordóñez, I'm Director of Southern Voice. We're a network of over 60 think tanks across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, working on informing issues around sustainable development. I think that from our perspective, I was trying to think how to bring forward our way of working with the issue of localization, and I think for us it's very much a vision of what maybe we could call a localization plus agenda. While we agree with the vision shown until now about localization and the relevance of local actors for their policymakers and for the discussions nationally. The plus that we believe in is that the organizations that are working locally across Africa, Asia, and Latin America have not only the capacity to inform policy at their national level, but also at the global level. So that's why I would put the plus there, because I think that for us, it's not only about localization in the sense of reducing the scope of work of these organizations to what happens locally, which may happen, because of the use of this word. And I see Chris suggesting a different phrasing also around it. But so for us, it's a vision of course, we need strong institutions and strong organizations at the nationals and local levels across the global south. And we also need these organizations to be able to influence global debates. And that is because we do want to cut through these perceptions that we've developed across the research ecosystem, that when knowledge is developed in the global north, it's universal, and when it's done at the global south, then it's just particular and contextual, right? So we want to make sure that we, in the process of strengthening organizations in the global south, we do not perpetuate this perspective, but that we actually break it. And as we can talk about localization plus, so strengthening local organizations for local evidence, but also for global influence. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Maurice, over to you.
Yes, thanks and good morning, everyone. I can introduce myself, Motisya Maurice. I work with the Zizi Afrique Foundation. And I want to begin from that perspective. Zizi Afrique Foundation, we are 5 years old, is a local organization based in Kenya, locally founded. And we have been immersing ourselves in this debate around localization and what does that mean for sustainability and growth of the institution itself, but also the work that we do within Kenya and in the region. Our mission is all children and youth learning and thriving, and we are very much focusing on foundational skills, particularly literacy, numeracy, and social-emotional learning, which we think are strong foundations for children, for them to be able to grow and to be able to thrive in life. And we do that through evidence consolidation, through innovations, and as well as engagement. And for us, one key thing around localization is that you cannot be able to generate evidence without resources. So they go hand in hand. And in that case, we believe if we have to localize, one element is try to get the resources where they are also most needed. But then with that, examining that, we also examine it with a bit of contrast, also local funding. That is also essential for us. As much as we want to talk about localization, I think also pushing for local funding from our governments, from philanthropies that are based within the continent and within the countries that we are working in, so that as resources also trickle down, we also contribute into that debate and also the development agenda of the region. But I want to focus on the localization also again around three elements and the success of it. 3 points, 3 or 4 points. One is about equals, where we see success is when institutions that are working within the context that we are in, and the global north and the south, there is kind of equality now we treat one another. And I think that's critical when you're moving with the agenda. And that is tied closely to the shared value. And one of the values in the system is around issues of respect and trust. Because at the end of the day, we get resources from the north, and to get that resources, the trust that we can be able to deliver, we can be able to do the work that we have been entrusted with. And I think that when we have that trust and respecting the relationships that we have with the global north, I think that's become so critical in terms of growing and ensuring that localization itself thrives. I also want to reflect that around agenda setting, and I think the agenda setting of the work that we do, we are in a context where we are immersing ourselves with the experiences, we are immersing ourselves with the key issues that we need to be able to research on, issues that we need to be able to generate evidence on, issues that we know affect the populations that we want to serve and the children that we want to grow in terms of the education, where I'm coming from, the space of education. So, and I see localization in terms of that kind of a balance of what is global need, but also what is locally relevant. So that as much as we are working, we want to have the ideas and the things that we think they're so pertinent to the population that they are serving. They're also getting resources to be supported, to generate the evidence, but also to engage better. I also want to, I think there is the element of capacity, and I think I see success whereby the local organizations have the capacity. And capacity for me is a little bit broad. I look at it in terms of the skills of the people that are there. I look at it in terms of the leadership. I look at it in terms of the systems that you do have to be able to even manage the resources that you have been given. I look at it in terms of the element whereby there is even trust within our governments. And I want to pick on that because localization agenda is also tied to how are we going to utilize the evidence that the local organization utilize it, because we are utilizing that evidence for impact. And one thing that I've also seen is traditionally the governments coming in place and saying, I think we need this evidence. We can trust the evidence that we are generating. So in that space, it means if we are localizing and there is the capacity, there is the will also by the governments and the different stakeholders that are working in to be able to utilize that evidence for impact. Otherwise, we could be able to localize, we could be able to generate evidence, we could be able to write papers, journal papers, but it's actually not translating in terms of the lives that we need to effect. And lastly is about peer learning, where we are learning within the region, but also globally, because, and I'm a strong believer that localization doesn't necessarily mean having institutions that are inferior. It means growing institutions that can be able to commit at a global level. It means having institutions where the leadership is strong enough such that it's ethical, it's creative, is innovative, and can be able to compete at a global level. Otherwise, I don't see localization as a way of babysitting organization. I'm seeing them as a way of growing organizations to become competitive and to be organizations that can be global think tanks within the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about already just by looking at success from the angle of success. And Maurice, you brought out this relationship with government. So on the other side of success, maybe the second question we want to pose to you. I'm not sure if I want to go in the same sequence, but Sajilu, you had a little bit of time, so maybe we can start with you again. On the other side of success, then what are the top 3 barriers for you to localization, which also includes shifting of power, which we already, all of you have touched on that, as well as resources to organization in the global south, which Maurice has also said. So from the other side of successes, what are the top 3 barriers to localization?
This is the question I dread the most. What are the barriers to localization? The first one, as we talk localization, localization has to happen within an ecosystem that supports that agenda. So that's the first point that I need to make. We see efforts towards localization in different shapes and sizes, but largely it's fragmented. So, and I want to recognize that. I mean, for something to gain traction, someone has to start doing something. So there is a lot of fragmentation, especially in the evidence space. So probably if we start dealing with that, where we invite people to say, let's sit around the fire, and how then do we come together and create an ecosystem that supports local institutions. The second one relates to the local institutions. We're looking at, we talk about building at the foundation, and what we mean by that is that we want to help and support local institutions to be more assertive when it comes to knowledge generation. So we find that their visibility sometimes is very difficult. Where I sit, I commission and manage evaluations, and when I'm looking for local firms, sometimes I have to admit it's a bit of a struggle. And then because of the pressure of work, you have to deliver these evaluations. You begin to say, who else can do this? And the default setting, unfortunately, sometimes is up north. So probably challenging people in this community of evidence generation as well to say, yeah, let's be more assertive, let's be visible when it comes to this as well. That's the other aspect. Of course, history, I'll go back to history. Adeline spoke eloquently about that. I mean, we have to acknowledge that when we talk about evidence, there's issues of, is this valid, is this credible? And then sometimes validity and credibility as gatekeepers. So again, that's another barrier as well that we need to talk about. It's not easy, it's a difficult conversation, but I see that as well as a barrier that we need to work with. Thank you.
Thank you, Sajilu. Such spot-on answers, and also keeping it nice and tight, because those, each one can be unpacked, I'm sure. Over to you. Let me just check if Andrea is there in the audience to just keep with that. Andrea?
Yes, thank you. I think I would stress two challenges that the researchers that we've been speaking to across the Global South have highlighted to us. And then the first one is the issue of agenda setting, that if we transfer funds, if we transfer capacities, but we don't transfer the decision making on the agendas for research, then we are not fulfilling the aim of localization. And I think one of the reasons why we see sometimes these attempts at localization but that don't maybe stick, or that they don't last, is because they are not based on actually giving the power and the agency of leading on the agenda, topic setting to the organizations that we want to shift the power to. So I think that's the one, because if we don't do that, then we're going to keep seeing organizations do some research, but then trying to steer towards the topics that they feel are relevant, right? So to sustain the prospects of localization, we really need to start with shifting the decision making around the agenda of studies and evidence creation. And then the second one I would add is a more persistent problem around the measures of credibility and quality that we use. That is also a very critical concern because, you know, funders, national, international, they are all kind of like using different types of indicators and shortcuts to figure out who is doing good research. And right now, those shortcuts are, you know, stacked against organizations in the Global South because if it's about publishing in high-ranking journals, if it is about you know, having these publications that as the most important signal of quality, then of course the organizations, the local organizations, may not appear as credible and as trustworthy to donors and other actors. So that is something that is a more strategic and structural change that would be needed, and that I think would help also not only the equity and the quality of research in the Global South, but also in the Global North, because it's really targeted towards having a very small number of highly prestigious organizations, institutions, and journals. But we know that that is not the only marker of quality. In fact, one of the researchers we were talking to said it better. He said, now we don't care what we research, we only care where we publish it. And that is something that affects, of course, the localization agenda, because if these local issues are not relevant, are not seen as something you know, related to quality, to trustworthy, then it's also going to keep failing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Chris, over to you. The top 3 barriers for you.
Yeah, so I think I'll touch on what I think others have mentioned. From sort of a funding perspective, I think there's just the issue of trust, that there's a lack of trust in local, the ability of local organizations to, one, set the agenda, sort of identify the right priorities, but then also to effectively use and manage funds, which then leads to a preference for international NGOs, international think tanks. And I'll speak about what we're doing as a foundation to try and do that. I think we practice what we call trust-based philanthropy, which is, you don't see Hewlett put out RFPs. I think we've only done that once as our evidence-informed policy-making strategy. All of our projects, all of our partnerships are co-created, that our partners are the ones that are in the lead. To the largest extent possible, we provide flexible funding, which then allows our partners to be able to flexibly respond to the needs of policymakers. Because I sit in the San Francisco Bay Area, the western part of the US. I don't sit here in Africa. I'm very far removed from the issues, from the problems that are happening. Yes, I'm African, I have the lived experience, but I feel like somebody who's in Uganda, ACAS, or our other partners are much more closer to the work and should be the ones to determine what really the priorities are. And so I think we, as a foundation, we're trying to shift as much of that decision-making power as possible and to simplify our processes. Because I think the other challenges with localization is just structural or institutional within the funding landscape. There's so much bureaucracy. I think you all know which funding not to apply to, because it's just going to kill your organization. You'll be asked for 200 pages of documents as part of the proposal. When it comes to reporting, you have to do 100 pages, and you have to do that every quarter. By the time you finish submitting the report, you're already working on the next report, and you don't have time at all to even do the work that you're being funded to do. And so I think as a foundation, we're also trying to change that and trying to find like-minded organizations, like-minded funders to begin to change practices. So if you look at our proposal template, if you've ever been invited to apply for funding at Hewlett, it's a maximum of 10 pages that you provide, and that's all. Our budget template is just 1 page. Our reporting, annual reporting, you report once a year, and it's a maximum of 15 pages. We don't even want any annexes at all, because we want to keep that burden as low as possible. And so what we're doing is then beginning to share these practices with other funders, hoping to begin to change overall practice, knowing that I think for other bilaterals, there are obviously laws and other systems that may not allow them to be as flexible, as nimble as we are, but I think there is scope for us to work with like-minded funders to begin to change those practices so that it's actually easier on local organizations to be able to access funding. And then I think the third is just these language and cultural barriers. I think Francophone West Africa is probably the one place that comes to mind that a lot of us don't even know how to work in French. I think we're all very comfortable working in English, that when an organization comes from West Africa, there's an amazing organization, ACED, in Benin, that does amazing work. Thankfully, they're bilingual, but there are others that are not bilingual at all. And so when we see their proposal and they've translated it using Google Translate, it doesn't render the same. Evidence terms don't come across the same. We just think this is a very poor proposal. There's no way that I'm going to fund it. So we haven't invested in the systems ourselves to begin to understand the culture within these other ecosystems where we may not be comfortable working. And I think as a foundation, we're also trying to change that. One of my colleagues is actually from Senegal, and now he's based out of Senegal, working, helping us to understand that region a little bit better and oversee that grant making within that region.
Thank you so much, Chris. Maurice, over to you.
Thanks. I just want to pick a point, a starting point from Chris, and particularly around the issues of standards and requirements. If you look coming now from an implementing organization, most of our funding is project-based. And if we have several donors that have different requirements, reporting timelines, and yet that project is not paying 100% of the time, it means someone has to cut across the 2 or 3 projects, and you have to report. So you spend so much time. I agree, Chris, I think that's, if we can get harmonization around reporting and requirements and standard, I think that would be critical. The second thing is around, I know it's good to do due diligence, to be able to know where the organizations are, but I think there is a positive aspect of it, of also working with organizations to be able to grow where there are weaknesses, and particularly financial systems, because they also cost money to invest on that. And if you do not have enough core funding, it means you may not have a very robust kind of financial standard systems that can be able to grow you, can be able to speak to the various requirements that the donor needs. So that I see as a barrier. And flexibility is also in terms of the funding. I know we tie most of it towards project activities, and in that a bit of flexibility in how you can be able to learn out of that work, other than output-based, but then flexibility whereby you can also be able to try some other things that are emerging within your system. I think that will put a lot of trust in delivery of organization and making organizations to be able to think outside the box. But then one key barrier I also note is around what you mean by localization. Do you have a common understanding around localization? And what models are working in terms of localization? And I'm happy to see quite a number of funders are now opening offices in this part of the world. Is that localization in the first place? The second thing that I'm seeing is also models whereby some funders may give, like you may get invest in the UK getting resources and then subcontracting a local organization to implement that. Is that localization? So I think if we can be able to develop a common understanding of what localization is, and that has a mutual benefit to the funder and to the local organization, I think that will be critical, such that we break that barrier. Otherwise, if we see several models, then it becomes elements whereby we are implementing, but actually we are not even in control of that evidence moving forward. But then there's also the issue of capacity. And I want to reflect this again on different note from my previous one when it comes to barriers. And this is in relation whereby we have great minds in this part of the world. But in most cases, by the time you're emerging, also the global organizations snatch you. Then we are left again, that organization is like growing leaders. Anytime you thrive, then you're also gone. We have, so what does that also mean? And I think it's, you can't control it, the brain drain, you can't control it. But I think within the context that we are in, is also finding ways of how to be able to keep those talents that can be able to help us maneuver some of these challenges, and particularly building a strong organization. I come back to the element of local funding, and I think that will still continue being one of the critical things that we need to continue investing in, and urging our governments to put some resources into research and advocacy. And tied to that is, you go to most of the African countries, they have created the National Research Fund, but it's geared towards STEM. Social sciences, you find there is actually very limited funding that is going there. Yet, we need a lot of evidence around these social issues. Education is social, these social issues. But if we focus on STEM alone, we create these technology, but they also have their own social elements into it. You cannot have growing someone STEM if they have not gone through quality education, if they are not living a healthy life. So we need to know these things are interdependent, and the localization aspect of it, also getting investments into it, I think that will be critical. But then there is a sense of responsibility that comes into it. And there's the Anden saying that to whom much is given, much is also expected. So it's standing up and saying, we need to deliver. We need to stand out. We need to showcase that we can actually be able to do it. Because you may have organizations that are invested with resources, but then they are also grappling with other issues of ethics or issues of trust. So that becomes so critical. And my last is around a united voice. I don't know. How do we work together? How do we speak the same language of localization? How do I speak today here and tomorrow go to a different forum and have a different language that I'm using? How do we grow that? How do we grow advocacy around localization, building systems that we are growing one another, and we are able to become resilient as we become globally competitive? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Birte, do we have time for one more question, or can we open up? Maybe. Okay, yeah, then we got. So, colleagues, a lot of food for thought, and in short time spans, the panelists have shared so much. Anyone with questions from the floor? And I'm not sure if someone's monitoring the online as well. I see a hand up there. 2 hands there. Okay, 3. Let me just say 1, 2, 3, and then we'll come on this side. Yeah, I see you and I see you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I'm monitoring the online feed. So this is a question from Martin Kapchanga, who's asking about how do we balance the benefits of funded projects to ensure that they're sustainable beyond the funding period. And I think that's an issue all of us have faced, whether we're funders or recipients of funds. So it'd be great to have your perspectives on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. I think we just keep that question and we take, there was one behind you and then another one, and we'll come back.
So thank you so much to our panelists. My name is Diana from JPAL. So my question is with regards to the length of funding. So knowing that the policy-making process usually can take a very long time before we actually see change or impact, I'm wondering whether the funding community is thinking about how do you innovatively have longer funding timelines. For instance, sometimes you can find funding is for 2 years, and maybe for you to be able to effectively influence policy, it may take up to 3, 4, 5 years. So sometimes you find institutions sort of leaving the processes hanging or trying to find other alternative ways to keep the process moving forward, sometimes with limited success, sometimes they're able to do better, but it would be great to hear what solutions are there.
Thank you, Dee. One more question, Bear, and then I'll come back to the panelists. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to delve deeper into the concept of localization. And so in my mind, I think of two things. There is localization, meaning at the grassroots, but there is localization talking about an African context. What does it mean in most of the funders' frameworks when they speak about localization in that sense? Because I work for PASGA, the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research. And while we might not be doing a lot of work in the grassroots, we do our work across Africa. So in that sense, we are localized. But how does that mean, correspond to the ideas that have been raised here with localization? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to the other questions. I don't know if there was funding related and then the question of localization. It's not posed to anyone specifically. Anyone from the panelists to jump in?
Okay, I'll combine the question on sustainability and length of funding and just talk to what we're doing as Mastercard Foundation. Sustainability is a big issue in development. And in fact, in one of our reviews, we identified sustainability as one of the key aspects. So we look at sustainability, resilience, because we live in a world of multiple shocks now, and then the aspect of equity. When we look at sustainability, we have come up with what we call a portfolio approach to programming. So when we say portfolio approach, we recognize that the issues that are being related, we talk about access to finance, for example. When we talk about access to finance, it's not only about working financial service providers and saying we can extend loans or grants to young entrepreneurs, but also there has to be the environment that encourages innovation, an environment that encourages the young woman to go into business. So we bring different players. Some of them also look at issues around policy, some look at mindset, some of the financial service providers. And in the portfolio approach is when we take a big bet where we say we do multi-year funding. And when it comes to measuring that funding on a regular basis, we also look at what's happening in terms of system change. So moving away from project by project funding to what we call portfolio approach. That really supports multiple players because we appreciate that where we operate, there is different challenges. So access finance does not necessarily mean working with a particular financial service providers, but we bring other players as well. So we talk about transformed financial inclusion or transformed access to finance that goes beyond your regular transactional aspects that you're saying, are we seeing commercially viable products that local financial service providers will continue offering way beyond the life of the foundation's investments.
Chris?
Yes, I think the question around localization, not looking by that, I think for us, it's interesting because we mentioned earlier, we're almost finalizing our new strategy. And our first outcome of the strategy is actually focused on localization, providing support to African organizations. And I think that's in terms of both funding, but also capacity building, that we want to capacitate African organizations, proximate organizations, acronym 5 or 6 in Anglophone Africa that everybody knows, everybody works with. Maybe 2 or 3 in Francophone Africa that everybody works with. And I think one thing that we don't want to do is sort of create the same dynamic between these large African organizations that we're seeing, between the Global North and Global Southern organizations, that you could then just create a Brookings that's based out of Kenya, that's working in all of Africa and there's nobody else. So it's also for us, for the next several years, is looking to serve as smaller, less well-known organizations that may not be as sophisticated as the usual suspects that everybody works with. And then bringing those up, building their capacity, providing resources to them so that we diversify the pool of organizations that are working with governments and providing different forms of evidence to governments. So I think that's a big priority for us, and it's an outcome within our new strategy. And then to the point, I think, from the question from Dayal around sort of the length of sort of these grants, being 2 years, 3 years. I think more so than a specific grant, for us it's a commitment to longer-term partnerships with our grantees. Yes, the grant might be for 3 years, but I think once you enter into a partnership with Hewlett, you're going to be in the portfolio for some time. Now, I can understand why a 5-year grant gives peace of mind if you're a leader running an organization. But I've also worked for bilateral before, where we actually signed 5-year contracts that were very rigid. And if everything changes, COVID happens, you can't adapt very easily, you can't change, you can't move money between budget line items. Now that's not necessarily a good thing either. I think it's the commitment to working with our partners for a long term, being flexible, allowing our partners to define what those priorities are that they work on, that sort of offsets these longer term, these shorter term grants that we provide. Because there's always a guarantee, unless something happens, that you get your next grant, and you get your next grant after that. And we have to exit from the partnership that will do that responsibly. We won't tell you today that this is your last grant and the grant ends tomorrow. Like, you have at least a year in advance. And if we can't do that, provide you with funding, some runway for you to be able to figure out, maybe fundraise and connect you to other people so that you can actually get the support that you need.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to just come on this side here before we come back to the panelists. So there was 2 questions here. Sorry, gentleman here, and I think Edward there. Can we get the mic to him? I also know that this question, the deeper one on localization, if we can maybe take the panelists on during lunch and tea time, we can start the discussion. Over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. My name is Sydney Sproul. I'm the Senior Strategy Officer at the Uganda National Academy of Sciences. Just one comment and a question, but was just a very interesting thing that I kept hearing was this global north, global south, which somehow sort of implies some sort of directionality. And an example of this is a time where I was talking to a colleague from outside, and they mentioned reverse innovations in Great Britain. What they were saying was they were taking things that were innovations made in Africa, and they applied them in the United Kingdom. And somehow this was a reverse innovation. And I was given a sort of a different way of thinking about this by a wonderful Jewish professor named Judy Lasker, who said we should probably think about this less about global north, global south, but perhaps global minority and the global majority, where the global minority is actually all of those which are in the global north. The second question I wanted to ask was, there's a lot of emphasis, and I keep hearing of this, and forgive me because I'm not an evaluator. Why do we keep talking about impact evaluations when it seems like in many ways we're talking about very, very messy and systemic issues, where the outcome is not always going to be very straightforward? You know, we keep talking about policies as the outcome or the impact that we want to see. We want to see a policymaker to change their practice, their ways of being. But at the same time, we keep saying, but this is really messy. They have so many different priorities. They have voters constituents to consider. They may think of things one day and change their mind the next. And so there are, though, from what I've heard, a lot of different types of evaluations, such as a developmental evaluation, which tries to focus and interrogate this idea of how do we get to just ways in which we've changed the systems so that we then do have an environment in which impacts can be created. But I keep hearing from funders, impact, impact, impact. And I'm sort of kind of going, but isn't that a contradiction in terms? Because on the one hand, you want to change the system and the culture, but at the same time, you still are beholden, or at least it sounds like you're beholden, to these sort of linear and discrete indicators. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question there, and then come back to the panelists.
Thank you. My name is Benson, and from Kenya. I work for Triple Lane, one of the former Young Impact from Mastercard Foundation. So I'm passionate about localization. So I have three things to challenge the Pan-African. One is about the resources. Two, articulating our own context. Number three is ability to solve our problem. So we cannot run out of the evaluation if we have not done the three circle: the resources, articulation of our own context, and ability to solve our problem. So we cannot shift power. And just as my friend said, the northern global are so powerful than the southern. Why? They have good technology, resources, and a lot of empowerment. So we will remain under the aid of localization if we have not articulated three key things. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I had the hand up there. That will be the last question, and then apologies to the panelists. Over to you after.
Thank you very much. Mine is not a question, but more of a comment. My name is Frejus Toto. I'm the Executive Director of the African Center for Equitable Development. We are working on evidence policy and action across Francophone West Africa. As I hear panelists and all colleagues talking about localization, I really want us to start thinking beyond just transferring more funds and capacity from, the global north to proximate or to local organizations, and start thinking about, when we talk about localization, we should also be aware of the need to make sure that those local organizations are really working on local issues, are really embedded into local content. Because you can have an organization which is based in Nairobi, which could definitely be called as a local organization, having all the staff being Kenyan, so we assume that they are closer to the issues. But in reality, maybe they are very far from the issues because they are not that close to the communities or to the problems that they are supposed to solve. So when we talk about localization, we should also be thinking about how we conceptualize that localization so that in the end, the metric that we look will not be how much do we transfer from funders to those proximate or local organizations, but how much do we now shift the power and make sure that those organizations are working on local problems and with local content. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to go over to Andrea to see whether she wanted to comment or answer any of those questions.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. I hope you heard the questions.
Yes, thanks. Well, I think I would just maybe react to the last comment that Fred just brought in, to totally agree with him on this, that it is this about like setting the agenda that is one of the most important calls, I think, for organizations in the Global South when it comes to localization. So beyond beyond the funds which are necessary, but not always the only need. So I think from us in Southern Voice, we see the opportunity of generating those spaces between think tanks and research organizations in the Global South to think through the issues that concern them, their priorities, and be able to position them more globally. And I think this goes in hand with the comments we've also heard in the panel before about the importance of having organizations that are locally grounded in issues, but that compete globally. And I think that's the other thing that I think is really important in terms of the administrative capacity, the capacity to speak and engage with peers worldwide in other regions, in the global north, and so on. So I think that's really important in terms of the localization agenda moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andres. Maurice, did you want to comment on any of the questions, and then we'll come back?
Yeah, just a quick one around catching on the last one around localization, and my experience of what we've been able to do around even localizing ourselves as well. We deliver through partnerships, and one of the key things that we have tried to do is bring in those partners that we are working with, and most of them are grassroots kind of organizations, to co-create with them, to think through with them, to identify their capacity needs as well, and to then to grow them. And we believe by doing so, we also try to entrench localization within the aspect, other than with the national organizations that are strong, getting the funding, and then the grassroots that are actually doing the service delivery on the ground, or they're implementing, then having no kind of ideas and capacity development from their end. The other one that I want to touch base is around the long-term funding and the aspect of the change that we want to see, and sometimes I see a bit of tension when you are developing these calls for proposals, or when you are responding to requests or something like that, whereby we as organizations sometimes we overpromise because we need the money. We need the money, so we overpromise. But when it comes to delivery, then it becomes a little bit problem. I think it's also for us to be able to sit at that negotiating table with the funders and tell them, we see this is feasible. Let's begin from this point, and then progressively we grow together towards creating the kind of impact that we want to create. Otherwise, we are setting ourselves from failure at the beginning, and we end up blaming someone else. Thank you.
Thank you. I see we have less than 5 minutes. Is that correct? No more questions. Okay. Birte, do you want to go? I thought we could do a quick round of just closing statements with the panelists, and maybe you can just do a quick reflection on what do you think you would need from the other person. So I think that we wanted to still explore. Actually wanted to hear about the impact question, but we will take that forward. A quick round of just closing statements. Maybe I can start on my right-hand side, Maurice, Chris, Sajilu, and then we'll close with Andrea.
Thank you, and it's an interesting discussion, and thanks for the opportunity and the listeners. I think my reflection possibly concluding on that is the need for a level playing ground, whereby we can be able to engage SPS, where we can be able to share in a very open-minded kind of discussion on how we can better localize and set the agenda for institutions that are working within the context that we are in. And I think that is also tied with kind of the preconditions that come in on the table when we are discussing this. But then I would say, I think the shift is good, the discussions are good, and while we know it takes time to be able to do things, and it is a moment for us to sit down back and reflect and see what is good for the local organization, for the international organization, for the funders, so that we come to the table when we have a kind of a mutual understanding and respect and value for one another. Thank you.
Yeah, I think very quickly, we as a foundation, we're very committed to working in a dignified way, dignifying our partners, both the think tanks we work with, but also government partners. Now, we don't have all the answers at all. I think we have good intentions. We want to be as respectful as we can to minimize the burden on our partners, transfer as much agency as we can to our partners. We're a learning foundation. We have perspectives. We have a perspective, and we want to be thought partners to the organizations that we work with. And so we're looking forward to learning from the field, the people who do the hard work. It's not us. I think what we have is we have a checkbook that our president writes to organizations, and that's powerful. But it's actually, we're not the ones that are doing the hard work. I think you all are the ones that are doing the hard work. I would like to see as many organizations get involved in supporting governments to make better decisions, from sort of the bigger Nairobi-based entities to the Nakuru-based entities that are working more local and sort of have the understanding of the local context within that, that we have that diversity. And I think if we do that, then that will be a success for us.
Yeah, maybe just pick this from where Chris left. From a foundation perspective, number one, we are committed to the localization agenda. A very difficult discussion, but we're committed to that. And yeah, an invitation as well. As a foundation, we have plans for the next few years. One is around building indigenous evaluation, reaching out to different people across the continent. We have a big initiative coming up, as well as investing in the young women and men. We just heard from a young impact associate who's been working with the foundation, so inviting other actors as well, funders, to say, yeah, join us in this journey. I heard a proverb yesterday that one stick just smokes, doesn't burn, so really bring all the sticks. Let's move forward with the localization agenda. Thank you.
Andrea, just your closing on your side.
Thank you. I think for us from Southern Voice, we are at the time of trying to start testing some new things. So we are really eager to find partners, organizations that are in the same space of trying to do things differently in practice, so that there is that opportunity to learn. But then we need to take that step forward. So organizations that are, are already thinking about this, are already thinking about how to position themselves differently, how to create these agendas that are grounded in local contexts, how to find new types of funding mechanisms and partnerships across the Global South that allows us to work together in different ways. So I think we are at that stage, and it would be great to connect with other organizations that are in that phase of testing the waters and trying new things. I think there is some appetite from some donors, so I think we can use that as a window of opportunity to test and learn and keep moving forward. Because I think in addition to all the things that we've discussed, there's also we need to learn about the limitations and the restrictions within our own contexts, legal, administrative, taxation-wise, all these things, to actually make the bulk of funds being able to be managed from the Global South. So there's a lot of space to learn, and we are really looking forward to the opportunities to test to get that learning happening. Thanks.
Thank you so much. What we can see is the learning never ends, and I think from Africa Evidence Network perspective, you can see a lot of horizontal relationships, but also the vertical relationships, and we've seen the ones coming between government as well as the many different initiatives. I think that this is where I want to hand over back to Birte to say that we do want to be able to deepen these discussions and come up with some way of moving forward, noting that so much has been happening. Over to you, Birte.
Right. Thank you to the panel, first of all. It's been really insightful and engaging, and thank you to the audience. It seems like there is appetite to continue this discussion, so I really hope that you will come back and join us in around 25 minutes. The idea is that we'll split into groups. We have several funders in the room, and we're going to try and make sure that they are also distributed between groups. I think that it's clear from the discussion that whilst there might be some different perspectives, there are some, I think, core, perhaps, actions and principles that there can be agreement around. And I think a goal so we will be asking you to write down the summary of your discussion, and this will be synthesized, and we'll sort of try and come up with a short list of actions that perhaps we'll ask people to also agree to publicly. And if we are many organizations that are behind some core principles, then we're stronger. So hoping to see you all back together after a bit of coffee.
You'll behave. Finished only 5 minutes late. Everyone.